I'll never forget my 45th milestone. That moment meant to celebrate everything I built. My husband Elliot, bless his heart, planned that surprise dinner party to bring us all back together. But that night, for family empires, from my daughter Leora and her husband Gideon, my son Rafe and his wife Cressida, my daughter Talia and her fiancé Soren, and their scheming inner circle Jasper and Vivian, went up in flames forever. This is a fictional story created for entertainment purposes only. It does not provide legal or financial advice. I tell the story from a distance now. Years have passed since that October evening in Greenwich, Connecticut, when the candlelight caught the crystal just so, and the smell of roasted duck and white truffle filled a dining room that had witnessed decades of carefully constructed silences. I tell it from a place of stillness, not emptiness, but the particular quiet that settles in your chest when you have finally, irrevocably, chosen yourself. But before I take you back to that night, there was something worth saying. Behind every word you're about to hear, there is a human being, someone who wrote this with intention, who chose the story because they believed you deserved to hear it. Now, let me take you back. My name is Elliot Ashford, and in the world I was born into, women like me were meant to be decorative, gracious at the dinner table, fluent in the language of understatement. We were meant to smell of gardenias and self-sacrifice, to smile at husbands who forgot our birthdays, and at children who called only when they needed something. We were meant to age quietly into the background of our own lives, like wallpaper that nobody notices until it begins to peel. I was born in a modest house in Fairfield County to a mother who pressed her dreams flat like flowers between the pages of books she never finished reading. My father was a man of ambition without follow-through, full of grand gestures and hollow promises. What I inherited from him was the awareness, sharp as broken glass, that I would never be him. What I inherited from my mother was something more dangerous, patience. I married Elliot Ashford when I was 22. He was 25, earnest-eyed and warm in the way that golden retrievers are warm, boundless in his devotion, terrible at reading a room. He loved me in the uncomplicated way that good men love women they don't fully understand. I never held that against him. There are worse things than being loved without being fully seen. What Elliot gave me without knowing it was time. While he worked his way up through the architecture firm, Ashford and Morris in downtown Greenwich, the one with the frosted glass doors and the ficus that always looked slightly dying, I worked quietly in the margins of our life, not as an afterthought, not as a hobby, as a strategy. It started with the house on Ridgeway Drive. We bought it in the mid-90s for $340,000, a number that felt terrifying at 24. When I was nursing Leora and repainting baseboards at midnight, Elliot assumed the mortgage was our ceiling. I understood it was a foundation. Over the years that followed, while Elliot drew blueprints and attended firm dinners, I made decisions, quiet ones, deliberate ones. Decisions that compounded slowly and invisibly the way certain things do when nobody is watching them grow. I built something in silence. I had assets that no one in my family knew existed. I had never depended on anyone for the things that mattered most. And I had done it all while looking to every person at my dinner table like a woman who had nothing of her own. I am not a woman who defines herself by numbers. But I am a woman who understands what numbers mean to people who have underestimated her. By the time I turned 40, I had perfected the disguise. I drove a 7-year-old Volvo. I fretted audibly about the cost of Thanksgiving. I perfected a small, worried furrow between my brows that said, quietly, I have nothing. I am nothing. Please don't look too closely. They never did. That was the thing about my children, my beautiful, entitled, catastrophically short-sighted children. They saw exactly what they wanted to see. And what they wanted to see was a woman fading, a liability in cashmere, a problem to eventually be managed. They had no idea that for 20 years, while they ate and grew and married and spent and smiled with teeth, that cost me $40,000 in orthodontia. I had been building something so vast and so quietly held that when it was finally revealed, it would not merely surprise them, it would unmake them. But on the morning of October 17th, 3 weeks before my birthday, I was still Elliot Ashford, dutiful and dim. I was standing at the kitchen island in our Cos Cob home, holding a cup of Earl Grey, watching the fog lift slowly off the back garden, when Elliot appeared in the doorway in his flannel robe, holding a yellow legal pad, looking like a man who had just discovered electricity. He told me he had an idea. His voice had that particular tremor it always carried when he was terribly pleased with himself, warm, slightly unsteady with excitement, the voice of a man who believed the world could be repaired with a good meal and the right people around a table. He wanted to throw me a dinner party, he said, a real one for my 45th. Everyone together, the children, their partners, Jasper and Vivian. The good china finally out of the cabinet. The dining room used for something other than storing Elliot's architectural drawings. He said the word surprise with the emphasis of someone presenting a solution they had spent days perfecting. I set down my cup very slowly. "That sounds lovely," I said. And I meant it, though not in the way he thought. Because 3 days earlier I had found the first message. And everything had already changed. Before we go any further, tell me where you're watching from today. Drop your city or country in the comments. I read every single one, and knowing you're out there, it matters more than you know. The Ashford family, on paper, was the kind that made strangers sigh with quiet envy. 3 grown children, a handsome home in Cos Cob, a husband with a respectable name on the door of a downtown firm, holiday cards that looked like they had been art-directed, a golden retriever named Biscuit who had the good sense to die before he could witness what came later. On paper, we were impeccable. In practice, we were a study in what happens when love is replaced, slowly and almost imperceptibly, by expectation. Let me introduce them to you properly. They deserve that, at least a proper introduction before the curtain falls. Leora was my firstborn, 28 years old, with cheekbones I gave her, and an entitlement she cultivated entirely on her own. She had Elliot's eyes, that particular shade of amber that catches light beautifully, and absolutely none of his warmth. Leora moved through the world the way certain women do, as though it had been arranged specifically for her comfort, and was perpetually failing to meet expectations. She had married Gideon Holt 3 years prior, at a wedding in Litchfield that cost more than most people earn in a decade. I paid for the flowers alone, $32,000 in white peonies and garden roses that wilted in the September heat. Before the reception was over, Gideon was 30, sharp-jawed and sharper-minded, a derivatives trader who spoke in percentages and looked at people the way a jeweler looks at stones, assessing value, calculating resale. He had identified Leora as an asset early. What he had not identified, because he was not nearly as intelligent as he believed, was that Leora's value was entirely borrowed from me. Their lifestyle, the Tribeca loft, the share in a Nantucket house, the wardrobe that Leora documented for 30,000 Instagram followers under the handle at Leora, curated, was sustained by a current that ran quietly beneath everything, invisible and reliable, the way underground. Water sustains a garden that appears to thrive on its own. They had never questioned the source. They had simply kept spending. That current was about to stop. Rafe was my middle child, and he had the particular tragedy of being charming without being capable. 25 years old, tall like Elliot, with a jaw that had gotten him out of more trouble than his personality ever earned him. Rafe had attended 3 colleges, not graduated from, attended, and had since built a life around the architecture of almost. He had almost launched a restaurant, almost closed a real estate deal, almost completed a certification in something I can no longer remember. What Rafe was genuinely excellent at was spending money with the focused dedication of a professional. He had married Cressida Keene 8 months prior, in a small ceremony that Elliot and I had attended with matching smiles and privately divergent thoughts. Cressida was 26, originally from somewhere in Ohio, with a laugh that arrived a half-second too late. The laugh of a person calculating whether something is worth finding funny before committing. She was pretty in the way of things that had been carefully maintained. She called me Mom from the second introduction, with a warmth so immediate and total that it sat on the skin like a costume. Cressida had married Rafe with the precision of a woman who had done her research and arrived at a wrong conclusion. She believed the Ashford name meant something financial. She believed Elliot's firm was more profitable than it was. She believed, most fatally, that I was a woman of no independent consequence. She had never been more wrong about anything in her life. Talia was my youngest and in some ways the most fascinating study, because she had taken the tools I had actually tried to give her, observation, self-possession, the ability to read a room, and weaponize them entirely for her own advancement. 22 years old, an influencer, which is a word our era has invented for a person who has monetized the performance of a life they are not actually living. Talia had 240,000 followers onto platforms, and an aesthetic so precisely calibrated, soft linens, coastal light, books she had never read arranged on shelves behind her, that it had begun to replace her actual personality. She was engaged to Soren Blake, 27, who wore his ambition the way other men wear cologne, present in every room before he entered it. Soren was the most deliberate person at that dinner table, and I say that with the clarity of someone who has spent years studying people carefully. He had attached himself to Talia not for love, not even for the Ashford name specifically, but for access. Access to the table, access to the conversation, access to whatever he believed was waiting to be taken. He was about to discover that what was waiting could not be taken, only returned to no one. And then there were Jasper and Vivian Cole. Jasper was Elliot's older brother by 7 years, 55, silver-haired, with the bearing of a man who had convinced himself that proximity to other people's success constituted his own. He had been moderately successful in commercial real estate in the 90s, and had spent the 2 decades since coasting on that identity like a man riding a wave that had long since broken. He loved Elliot genuinely, in the limited way that people love those they have decided are beneath them. He called me Elle and always stood slightly too close. Vivian was 52 and had been planting seeds of doubt in this family for so long that she had forgotten she was doing it. It had become reflex, a small comment about Rafe's choices here, a meaningful glance about Leora's spending there, a gentle suggestion, over Easter dinner 4 years ago, that perhaps Elliot carried a great deal in this marriage, don't you think? She said these things with the smile of a woman who believes she is simply being honest. Honest people rarely need to say quite so much. Together, Jasper and Vivian had spent years positioning themselves as a family steady center. The wise ones, the reliable ones, the ones Elliot trusted completely. What they had, in truth, was a shared interest in whatever they imagined I was worth. They had been circling the Ashford estate for years with the patient, unhurried attention of people who believed time was on their side. They were wrong about that too. And Elliot, my Elliot, I have saved him for last not because he matters least, but because he matters most and because describing him requires a different kind of care. Elliot Ashford was 48 years old, and he was, in the most uncomplicated sense of the word, good. Not naive exactly, though he was that too. Good in the structural sense, built from it, the way certain old houses are built from materials that simply do not rot. He had loved me for 23 years with a steadiness that I had sometimes taken for granted, and never, not once, stopped being grateful for. He did not understand me fully, but he had never tried to diminish what he couldn't understand. And in the world I had moved through, that was rarer than anything I had ever built. He planned that dinner party with the pure, uncomplicated joy of a man who believed that gathering people in a room could fix the fractures between them. He had no idea what those people had already set in motion. He had no idea what I already knew. And he had no idea that the dinner party he was building, with such tender and oblivious love, was going to become the most important evening of both our lives. The family smiled when he called to invite them. Every single one of them smiled. And not one of those smiles meant what Elliot thought it meant. Elliot announced the dinner party on a Sunday. That detail matters. Sundays in our house had always been the softest day. The day the light came through the kitchen windows at that particular low angle. That made everything look like a painting of itself. The day Elliot made eggs and read the physical newspaper and hummed without realizing he was humming. Sundays were the day the house exhaled. He chose a Sunday deliberately, I think, because he wanted the news to land gently. He wanted it to feel like a gift unwrapping, not a summons. It was October 17th, 3 weeks before my birthday. The fog had burned off by mid-morning, and the back garden was doing that beautiful, melancholy thing it does every autumn in Connecticut. The maples turning that impossible shade of amber, the last of the hydrangeas going papery and pale, the whole world quietly preparing to let go of something. I was at the kitchen island with my Earl Grey. Elliot came in from his study holding his yellow legal pad, and his face had that particular brightness that I had learned over 23 years meant he had been scheming in the best possible sense of the word. Elliot's schemes always involved other people's happiness. That was his particular gift and, as it turned out, his particular blindness. He told me his idea, with the focused enthusiasm of a man who had rehearsed it. A real dinner party, not takeout on the sofa, not a rushed Sunday lunch. Everyone, the whole family, dressed up, the good china, the dining room actually used for once. All 10 of us around the table on November 7th. A proper celebration. A surprise for the others, though obviously, he said, with a smile that could have powered a small house, he was telling me. I set down my cup very slowly. That sounds lovely, I said. And I meant it, though not in the way he thought. Elliot spent the next 3 days making calls. I heard him from the hallway, from the garden, through the study door, his voice carrying that warmth it had when he was at his most himself, extending invitations with the generous, unhurried energy of a man who genuinely believed that gathering people in a room could repair what had quietly broken between them. I was not supposed to know about the calls. This was a surprise dimension of the surprise dinner party. Elliot had always been endearingly bad at keeping secrets. He hid birthday gifts in the third shelf of his closet behind architecture journals. He could not suppress a smile when he knew something he didn't. I listened to each call from wherever I happened to be in the house, with the stillness of a woman who has been listening carefully for a very long time. And what I heard, beneath the warmth of Elliot's invitations, were the responses filtering back through the walls. Leora called him back within the hour, which was already unusual. Leora operated on her own time, returning calls when it suited her, arriving when it was convenient. An immediate callback meant she had been waiting for something. Her acceptance was swift, gracious, and precise. But beneath the graciousness was a question, delivered in that particular soft register she used when she wanted something without appearing to want it. She asked whether it would just be family, or whether Elliot was thinking of something larger. When he confirmed it would be intimate, just the 10 of us, her response carried a satisfaction that had nothing to do with birthday celebrations. I felt it even through the wall. A single word, landing with the quiet weight of a door closing on a room that had just been confirmed empty. Rafe's acceptance was quick and uncomplicated on the surface. The response of a man who had already decided he would attend before the question was fully asked. But then he circled back, the way Rafe always did when he was trying to appear casual about something. That was not casual at all. He asked about me, whether I was doing all right, whether I seemed okay to Elliot. He framed it as concern, dressed it in the loose clothing of a devoted son checking in on his mother. But the question beneath the question was something else entirely. He was assessing, confirming, filing information that would be useful later. When Elliot assured him I was fine, better than fine, wonderful, Rafe accepted the answer too quickly. People who are genuinely concerned about someone do not accept reassurances that fast. Talia did not call at all. She sent a message, brief, bright, decorated with small digital hearts, confirming she and Soren would be there and asking, almost as an afterthought, whether I was still avoiding social media. When Elliot confirmed that yes, I was still off all platforms and please, no posts. This was a surprise. She replied with enthusiasm that felt, even in text form, like a hand waving away something inconvenient. I read the exchange later that evening. I noted it. I moved on. What struck me most was Jasper. Jasper did not answer when Elliot called. He let it go to voicemail, which was, for Jasper, strategic. Jasper never let calls go to voicemail by accident. He returned the call that same evening with a smoothness that told me he had spent the intervening hours deciding exactly what to say and how to say it. He accepted enthusiastically. He called the dinner party a wonderful idea. He used a phrase that traveled through the study wall and lodged itself precisely in my memory. Something about how this was exactly what everyone needed right now. What everyone needed right now. Not what I needed. Not what Elliot had planned. What everyone needed. I stood in the hallway holding a glass of water I had forgotten to drink, turning that phrase over quietly in my mind, feeling its edges. In the days that followed, the calls began to come to me directly. Leora rang on a Tuesday, not her usual Sunday, and the call lasted 22 minutes. She asked about my health with the concentrated attention of someone collecting information rather than offering comfort. She asked whether I had seen my doctor recently, whether the first was sleeping, whether the house felt manageable, just the two of us with Elliot keeping such long hours. She said she worried. She said it softly, with great tenderness. The way a hand laid gently on a shoulder can be caring or can be testing. And the difference lives entirely in intent. I'm perfectly well, darling, I said. She said of course I was. Of course. Rafe mentioned in a brief call 3 days later that he and Cressida had been speaking with someone, just casually, just in passing, who dealt with family legal matters. He offered this wrapped in the language of forward thinking, of responsible planning, of looking after the family's future. He attributed the idea to Cressida, which was either honest or convenient. With Rafe, the two were rarely distinguishable. How thoughtful, I said. He agreed that it was. He moved on quickly, so did I. After I hung up, I stood at the window for a long time, watching the maple in the back garden release another cluster of leaves to a wind. I could not feel them inside the glass. Family legal matters, planning ahead. What everyone needed right now, the pieces were accumulating, with a patience that almost matched my own. I needed for more days. Because on the 21st of October, I would pick up Elliot's phone to check the weather while he was in the garden, and find, open on the screen, a message thread I was never meant to see. A group thread, named with a tidiness that almost made me admire it. Family future planning. The phone was warm in my hand. Elliot had left it on the kitchen counter, face up, screen still lit when he went outside to check on the garden beds. He had been meaning to winterize for 3 weeks. It was a Saturday morning, gray and still. The kind of October day that feels like the world holding its breath. I had reached for it to check the weather, the way I had done 100 times before with the easy thoughtlessness of a woman in her own home. The screen showed a notification. A group message thread. Family future planning. I stood very still. In 23 years of marriage, I had never read Elliot's messages without his knowledge. Not once. I want to be precise about that because it matters, not as justification, but as context. I was not a suspicious wife. I was not a paranoid woman. I was simply a woman who had spent decades developing the instinct to recognize, with absolute clarity, the exact moment when the world shifts beneath you and you must decide, in the space of a single breath, whether to look away or to look directly. I looked directly. The thread had 6 members: Liora.Gideon.Rafe.Cresssida.Tala.Jasper. Not Elliot, which told me everything about the nature of the conversation before I had read a single word. Not Soren either, which surprised me briefly, until I understood that Soren was too careful to attach his name to anything that could be traced back. He operated through Talia, the way certain people operate through others, present in every decision, absent from every record. Vivian was mentioned separately, described as handling things from her own side, close enough to be useful, distant enough for cover. The thread went back 11 days. I read it from the beginning. Jasper had started it. He had been doing research, the kind of research that people do when they have decided on an outcome and are working backwards toward justification. He believed that I could be removed from control of my own life through a formal legal process. He believed the path was clearer than most people assumed. He believed, most crucially, that I had nothing worth protecting and therefore no reason to fight back. He shared his findings with the group with the patient thoroughness of a man who was proud of what he had discovered. Leora responded with logistics. Gideon responded with asset questions. He wanted to understand what was actually at stake, what could be expected, what the numbers looked like once everything was in place. He had been researching the value of the house, Elliot's firm, the visible surface of our life together. He had constructed an estimate. He was working from the outside of a building and had no idea what was inside the walls. They had no idea what unsettled them, and what surfaced in the thread with a candor that I found almost endearing was that they did not actually know what I had. Leora acknowledged it plainly. I had always been vague about money, she wrote. Elliot handled everything. They were operating entirely on assumptions, on appearances, on the image of a woman who had spent decades looking quietly dependent and financially inconsequential. Rafe's contributions had the particular quality of a man who had convinced himself that what he was doing was an act of love. He framed their plan not as a seizure but as a rescue. He used the language of care, of protection, of a family stepping in for someone who could not manage alone. He wrote that they would be helping me, that I would thank them eventually, that this was the responsible thing, the kind thing. I read that framing 3 times. The architecture of self-deception is remarkable when it is built with genuine feeling. Rafe was not pretending to care. He simply cared in a direction that happened to be entirely convenient for him. That, I had long understood, was the most dangerous variety of betrayal, the kind that comes wrapped in sincerity. Cressida had done the practical work. That was clear from the tone and precision of her messages, organized, forward-looking, stripped of sentiment. She had made up her mind long before anyone else in the thread had caught up, and she had moved toward her goal with a precision that left no room for doubt. She had found the right professional contacts. She had mapped the steps from intention to outcome with the quiet efficiency of a woman who treats other people's lives as problems to be solved. She was counting on me to react. She believed that if the conditions were right, if the pressure was sufficient, if the evening was designed carefully enough, I would give them exactly what they needed. A moment, a reaction, something that could be pointed to afterward as evidence of what they had already decided was true. They were counting on me to stumble. They had spent 22 years watching me hold my composure in rooms that were designed to diminish me, and they had concluded, somehow, that I was fragile underneath. Talia's role in the thread was smaller but revealing. She asked the question that told me the most about where her loyalties had settled. She wanted to know whether Elliot would find out. The response came quickly from her siblings. Elliot would understand once it was done. He would be relieved. He loved me but couldn't manage the situation on his own. He would thank them, in time, for making the decision he hadn't been able to make himself. Gideon closed the conversation with an efficiency that required no elaboration. Elliot, he wrote, was not relevant to the process. I placed the phone back on the counter, face up, screen still lit exactly as I had found it. I picked up my Earl Grey. I walked to the window, and I stood there watching Elliot in the garden, crouched over the winter beds in his old gray jacket, working with the careful, unhurried attention of a man who finds comfort in tending things. And I felt something move through me that was not rage. Rage would have been simpler. What I felt was colder and more precise than rage. It was the particular clarity of a woman who has just been handed, completely by accident, every single thing she needs. They were counting on my reaction. I had been preparing for exactly this kind of moment for 20 years. Over the following 2 weeks, I did 3 things, quietly and without deviation. I contacted my attorney, a man who had handled my private affairs for many years, who knew every document, every asset, every decision I had made in silence since long before this threat existed. I told him what I had found. He listened. Then he asked how I wished to proceed. I told him. He said he would have everything ready by November 5th. I updated my estate documents, completely and irrevocably. The papers were signed and witnessed on a Tuesday afternoon in late October, while rain came down in sheets outside and neither of us touched the coffee that was brought to us. And I began preparing what I privately called the presentations, one for each empire, for fires laid with care, waiting only for the right moment and the right room. November 7th was 3 weeks away. I had never been more ready for anything in my life. Before we go further, I want to ask you something. If you have found those messages, seen your own family planning to take everything from you, what would you have done? Tell me in the comments, because what I did next, not everyone would have had the patience for it. November 7th arrived the way significant nights always do, quietly, without fanfare, as though the world had agreed not to announce what was coming. I spent the afternoon in deliberate stillness. I bathed slowly, dressed with care, and sat at my vanity for longer than usual, not out of vanity, but because I needed to look at myself in the mirror and confirm that the woman looking back was ready. She had been ready for weeks. She had the composure of someone who has already lived through the worst version of a thing in her imagination and arrived intact. On the other side, I wore navy, not black. Black would have signaled mourning, and I was not mourning anything. Navy said something quieter and more precise. It said, I was here before any of you, and I will be here after. Elliot had been buzzing with restless, delighted energy since morning. He had arranged the caterers, chosen the wine, pressed his good shirt 3 times until the collar satisfied him. He had set the dining room himself, the long mahogany table that we used perhaps twice a year, the good china that had been my grandmother's, the crystal that caught candlelight and threw it against the walls in small, trembling constellations. He had placed a small arrangement of white roses at the center of the table. He was, in every sense, a man in his element, creating warmth, building a container for love, absolutely certain that what he had assembled would hold. I watched him from the hallway and felt something complicated move through my chest. He had no idea he had built the stage for something else entirely. They arrived between 7 and 7:30. Leora and Gideon came first, which did not surprise me. Leora had always needed to arrive before others, to orient the room, to establish position, to be seen settling in rather than arriving late. She wore a cream silk blouse and her good pearls, and she kissed my cheek with a warmth that landed precisely 2 degrees above freezing. Gideon shook Elliot's hand with the firm, practiced grip of a man who has decided that physical confidence substitutes for genuine authority. He looked around the dining room with the quick, assessing sweep I recognized immediately, not admiring the space, pricing it. Rafe and Cressida arrived 12 minutes later. Rafe had made an effort, jacket, actual shoes rather than the expensive sneakers he favored, and he hugged me with the loose, easy affection that had always been his particular gift. Rafe's warmth was genuine. That had always been the tragedy of him. He was capable of real feeling. He had simply allowed Cressida to redirect the feeling into something useful. She greeted me with both hands clasped around mine and a smile of such concentrated sincerity that I nearly admired the craftsmanship. She asked softly how I was feeling, whether the week had been tiring, whether I needed anything. I told her I had never felt better. She said she was so glad, and her eyes moved briefly, just briefly, to Leora across the room. Talia arrived with Soren at 7:25, and they moved through the door the way people do when they have rehearsed an entrance without admitting to themselves that they have rehearsed it. Talia was luminous in the way of someone accustomed to being looked at, dressed for documentation, even when there was no camera present, which was, I suspected, a condition she could no longer switch off. She held me tightly and told me I looked beautiful, and it was the most honest thing she said all evening. Soren shook Elliot's hand in mine, made the correct remarks about the house and the occasion, and then found a position in the room from which he could observe everything, without appearing to observe anything. I recognized the position. I had occupied it myself for 20 years. Jasper and Vivian came last. Jasper embraced Elliot with the expansive warmth of a man who loves his brother, and has never examined what else lives alongside that love. Vivian kissed my cheek and told me the table was stunning, and then said, almost immediately, in the same soft breath, that I looked tired around the eyes. Was I getting enough rest? She said it with such gentle concern that 2 of the younger couples registered it visibly. Across the room, filed it away. A seed, planted in the first 4 minutes of the evening. Vivian had been doing this for years. Small observations, precisely placed. The steady, patient construction of a story she needed other people to believe. I smiled and told her I had been sleeping beautifully. Elliot poured the wine himself, moving around the table with a happiness so unguarded it was almost painful to witness. He toasted to family. He toasted to togetherness. He said my name with a tenderness that silenced the room for just a moment. A genuine moment, unscripted, the kind that cuts through performance simply by being real. I looked at each face around that table as he spoke. Leora, composed and watchful. Gideon, calculating behind a smile. Rafe, warm and compromised. Cressida, alert beneath her graciousness. Talia, performing ease with the practiced fluency of someone who had made a career of it. Soren, cataloging everything behind eyes that gave nothing back. Jasper, expansive and certain. Vivian, already scanning for her next opening. 8 people who believed they were sitting at a table with a woman who did not know what was coming. 8 people who had built their plans on a single, catastrophic assumption that I was exactly what I appeared to be. I lifted my glass, I smiled. And I thought, not yet, but soon, the dinner was served at 8. The room performed exactly as Elliot had imagined. Warm light, good wine, the soft percussion of silverware against my grandmother's china. Conversation moving in that careful, surface-level register that families use when they are all, in their different ways, waiting for something. I ate slowly. I listened to everything, and I waited for Elliot to stand. Elliot stood at 9:15. He tapped his glass gently, the way he always did when he had something to say. And the table quieted with the instinctive deference that good people grant to genuinely good men. He spoke about the year, about the family, about what it meant to him to have everyone gathered in one room, to celebrate the woman who had been. He paused here, and his voice shifted into something unscripted and unsteady. The most constant thing in his life for 23 years. Leora smiled. Rafe nodded. Talia pressed her lips together in what photographed his emotion. Elliot raised his glass and said my name. Everyone raised theirs. And then I stood up. There was nothing dramatic about the way I rose. No sharp movement, no announced intention. I simply set down my wine glass, placed my napkin on the table, and stood, and something in the quality of my stillness made the room shift almost immediately. Elliot sat down. He knew me well enough to understand in that moment that what was about to happen was mine. I had prepared remarks. I did not use them. What I had prepared instead was something more durable than words, a series of documents, organized and bound, that my attorney had delivered to the house that morning. I had placed them, before the guests arrived, in a slim leather case beneath my end of the table. No one had noticed it. No one had thought to look. I reached down and lifted the case onto the table. The room watched me. I opened it. I began with gratitude, because I meant it and because beginning with what you mean disarms people who are prepared for performance. I thanked Elliot for the dinner, for the roses, for 23 years of a love that had never asked me to be smaller than I was. I said this looking directly at him, and I saw something register in his face, a recognition that this was not a standard birthday toast, that the woman standing at the end of his carefully set table had arrived with something more than sentiment. Then I turned to the table. I told them I had found the thread. Not with anger. I had processed the anger weeks ago, in private, in the way that women who intend to survive learn to process things before the moment arrives. I said it as a simple fact, the way you state the weather or read the date from a calendar. I had found the group message. I had read all of it. I had read every exchange, every plan, every calculation, every assumption they had made about who I was, and what I had, and what they believed they could take. I said the last 4 words Gideon had written, the ones that had closed the discussion, aloud in the silence of that dining room. The silence that followed was total. Leora's composure held for approximately 4 seconds, before it developed a fracture visible only around her eyes. Gideon went very still in the particular way that men go still when they are calculating, whether denial remains an option in arriving, slowly, at the answer. Rafe looked at Cressida. Cressida looked at the table. Talia's hand moved toward her phone by reflex before she stopped it. Soren's expression did not change at all, which told me more about the depth of his preparation than any reaction could have. Jasper opened his mouth. I raised one hand and he closed it. Vivian said my name, soft repositioning, the voice she used when the ground had shifted and she needed a new foothold. I looked at her and said, gently, that I would get to her. I opened the first folder. It held a written record of what had flowed from my household into Leora and Gideon's life over 7 years. Not assumptions, not estimates, documents, formal, dated, signed. Every transfer, every arrangement, every commitment made on their behalf that they had accepted without acknowledgement, and built their lifestyle upon as though it were simply the natural order of things. The total was significant. I placed a summary page face up on the table and slid it toward them without comment. Then I placed beside it something Gideon had put in writing himself, a formal proposal, sent to a professional contact, in which he had treated the future of this family's estate as a financial instrument. He had done this while sitting at my table on holidays, while shaking my hand at Christmas, while accepting wine I poured for him. He had signed his name to it. Leora looked at the page. Then she looked at me. And for just a moment, brief as a candle in wind, I saw beneath everything she had constructed over 28 years, the girl I had held at midnight when she was afraid of the dark. I felt the full weight of what she had chosen to become. I did not look away from it. Then I moved to the second folder. Rafe's folder was quieter in its devastation, which in some ways made it harder to present. It documented years of financial support, loans that had never been discussed as loans, arrangements that had been accepted as simply the way things were, a pattern of reaching into something that had always been open without ever once asking whether it should remain so. But what the folder was really about was Cressida, because Cressida had not joined a plan. The written records made that clear. She had started one. Long before the group thread existed, long before the others had begun their research, Cressida had already been in contact with the right people, asking the right questions, building the foundation upon which everything else had been constructed. She had been sitting at my Christmas table while she did it. She had called me Mom. I placed irrelevant pages in front of her without a word and watched her read them with the still, controlled expression of a woman who had prepared for many outcomes, but had not prepared for this. One, for the possibility that the records she had generated herself would be the thing that undid her. Rafe looked at his wife for a long moment. Whatever he found in her face confirmed what the documents had already told him. He looked back at the table and did not look up again for a very long time. The third folder belonged to Talia and Soren. I slid it across the table without ceremony. Talia looked at it the way people look at things they sense will change something permanently, with a brief, involuntary hesitation, the pause of someone standing at the edge of a door they cannot unknow they opened. Talia had built her empire from image rather than assets, which meant that what the folder contained was not primarily financial documentation, but something she valued more completely: visibility. The written record of what she and Soren had constructed together, and more precisely, what Soren had constructed around her without her full knowledge. Soren had put things in writing. That was his first mistake, and in some ways his only one, because everything else he had done had been careful, considered, and difficult to trace. But ambition at a certain temperature becomes impatient, and impatient people sign their names to things they should not sign. He had submitted a formal proposal to a group of outside investors. In it, he had outlined a structure he was building, a business arrangement that would grow Talia's platform, RM into something considerably more profitable. The proposal was detailed, confident, and signed, and buried within its financial projections, described in the clean, neutral language of business documentation, was a reference to anticipated changes in the Ashford family's estate, changes he described as forthcoming, as expected, as already in motion. He had been raising money on the basis of my anticipated removal from my own life. He had put it in writing. I placed the document in front of Talia. She read it once. The room was very quiet. Then she read it again, more slowly, and I watched the specific quality of her attention shift. The shift that happens when a person stops reading a document and starts understanding what it means about the person sitting beside them. She looked at Soren. Soren met her gaze with the composed, calibrated stillness of a man selecting his next move from a prepared list. He said nothing. He had decided, correctly, that anything he said in that room would cost him more than silence. What he had not decided, what I suspect he had never genuinely considered, was that there was no move available to him that would change what had already been documented, signed, and placed on that table. Talia set the pages down. She did not look at him again for the rest of the evening. The fourth folder was Jasper and Vivian. I had saved them for last deliberately, because their betrayal required a different kind of attention. What Leora and Rafe and Talia had done carried the specific violence of things that originate inside the body, the particular wound of children who look at their mother and see only what they need her to be. That wound had its own category, its own grief. What Jasper and Vivian had done was structural. They had built the frame around everything else. They had been the architecture of this plan. Long before the plan had a name, years of quiet influence, of conversations with each child that pointed in a single direction, of doubt planted so carefully and over such a long period of time that the children had arrived at their conclusions believing those conclusions were their own. Jasper had shared things with the group that had come to him, through Elliot, through 20 years of brotherhood of Sunday phone calls, of the particular trust that exists between men who grew up in the same house. Elliot had told his brother things in good faith. Jasper had filed those things and used them. The written records made that visible, not interpretation, documentation. His own words in his own hand, in messages and correspondence that he had generated and that had been preserved with the indifference that records always have toward the people who create them. I placed a folder in front of him and waited while he read. Jasper was a man who had believed he was careful. Most people who operate in the margins of other people's lives believe that. They forget that the margins leave their own record in the responses they generated, in the decisions they shaped, in the chain of events they set in motion that could be traced, with patience, back to a single source. He read slowly. His face did not change in any dramatic way. What changed was something smaller and more final, a quality of certainty that left his expression and did not return. He looked, by the time he set the pages down, like a man who had been living in a house that had just been revealed to have no foundation. Vivian did not read her pages immediately. She sat very still, hands folded in her lap, looking at the center of the table with the expression of a woman who has just understood, fully and without room for revision, the complete shape of a decision she made years ago and has been living inside ever since. She said my name once, very quietly. I looked at her. I did not speak. Sometimes silence is the most precise response available, and I had learned over the course of a lifetime to use it with care. I placed the final document in the center of the table, not in front of anyone specifically. In the center, where all of them could see it. It was my will, signed. Witness.final. I did not read it in its entirety. I summarized it clearly and without inflection. The way you state something that has already been decided and no longer requires discussion. Everything I had built, every asset held quietly under my name, every decision made in the margins of this family's life, the full architecture of 22 years of patient, invisible work was to go, in its entirety, to for charitable organizations, a foundation supporting women's financial independence, a housing trust for elderly residents in Fairfield County, a scholarship fund at the community college where I had taken my first course in finance at 26, and a legal aid organization that helped women navigate contested estate proceedings. Every person at that table received nothing. I placed a valuation summary face up at the top of the document. I will not repeat the number here. I will only say that it was considerably larger than any of them had imagined possible. Considerably larger than the house they had been pricing. Considerably larger than the life they thought they were taking. The silence in that room was the loudest thing I have ever heard. I looked at each of them one final time. In the same order I had looked at them during Elliot's toast, the same 8 faces, entirely. Different rooms behind their eyes. Then I sat down, folded my hands in my lap, and said that the caterers had prepared dessert, and that anyone who wished to stay was welcome to it. No one stayed, they left in stages. The way things collapse, not all at once, but in a sequence that had its own particular logic. Gideon was first. He stood before anyone else had processed what had happened, pushed back his chair with the controlled movement of a man who has decided that exit is the only remaining power available to him, and walked to the hallway without a word to anyone at the table. Not to Leora, not to Elliot, not to me. The front door opened and closed with a quietness that was somehow worse than a slam. The quietness of a man who has already begun calculating his next position, before the current one has fully ended. Leora followed 30 seconds later, pausing at the doorway of the dining room with her coat already in her hands. She had retrieved it with a speed that suggested she had been mentally rehearsing departure for some time. She looked at me once from the doorway. There was something in her face that was not quite remorse and not quite anger, but something in the complicated territory between them. The expression of a woman who has not yet decided what story she will tell herself about this night. She opened her mouth, then she closed it, then she left. Soren guided Talia out with a hand at the small of her back, the gesture of a man maintaining the appearance of control over a situation that had ceased to be controllable. Talia looked back at me from the hallway with eyes that were wet and, I believed, genuine. Of all of them, Talia's grief that night felt the most real. Perhaps because she was the youngest, or perhaps because somewhere beneath the performance she had constructed around herself, there was still a daughter who had not entirely decided to become what she had become. I held her gaze for a moment. Then Soren's hand moved and she turned away. Rafe left without looking at Cressida. That detail, small, almost invisible in the larger wreckage of the evening, was the one that stayed with me longest. He stood, buttoned his jacket with the deliberate focus of a man occupying his hands because he did not trust what his face was doing, and walked to the door. Cressida gathered her things and followed at a distance, and the space between them and that hallway was the most honest thing either of them had expressed all evening. Jasper shook Elliot's hand at the door. I watched from the dining room. It was a long handshake, the kind that carries 20 years of shared history, and the sudden, unbearable weight of what has just been revealed about the nature of that history. Elliot let go first. Jasper said something I could not hear. Elliot nodded once, slowly, and his face was very still. Jasper left without looking back. Vivian paused in the dining room doorway on her way out. Just for a moment. She looked at me, and I looked at her, and whatever she had intended to say dissolved somewhere in the space between us. She left quietly. The front door closed for the last time. The house went still. And then there was Elliot. He stood in the dining room with his hands at his sides, still in his good shirt, in the room he had spent 3 weeks preparing, surrounded by the remains of a dinner that had become something he had not planned and could not have imagined. The white roses were still at the center of the table. The candles were still burning. The dessert the caterers had prepared sat untouched in the kitchen. He looked at me for a long time without speaking. I had prepared for many things in that moment. For anger, for the particular hurt of a man who feels implicated in something he did not choose, for the grief of someone who has loved generously and discovered that his generosity had been used as cover for cruelty. I had prepared, quietly and alone, for the possibility that Elliot might look at the full picture of what I had revealed. Not only the betrayal of the children, but the 22 years of assets he had not known existed, the decisions made in silence, the life I had built in the margins of our shared one, and feel deceived by me, as much as by them. That was the thing I had not been able to fully resolve in all the weeks of preparation. I had resolved everything else. The documents, the timing, the sequence of what needed to be said and shown. I had not been able to resolve the question of what Elliot would see when he looked at me after the room emptied. He crossed the dining room and sat down beside me. Not across from me, beside me, in the chair Leora had occupied, pulling it close so that our arms were nearly touching. He was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the last car faded down the driveway. The house settled into its nighttime silence. Then he said he wished he had known. Not about the money. Not about the assets or the documents or the years of careful, invisible work. About the fear, he said. About whatever it was that had made me feel I needed to build something that large in that much silence, alone, without telling him. I looked at him. I told him it had not been fear. I told him it had been patience. I told him there was a difference between the two, and that the difference mattered enormously. I told him I had never built what I built as protection against him, only as protection against the version of my life in which I disappear quietly and completely into the needs of people who have mistaken my stillness for emptiness. He was quiet for a while. Then he asked why I had let him plan the party, why I had not told him what I found, what I knew, what I intended, why I had let him build something so carefully, with such love, with his yellow legal pad and his pressed shirt and his white roses, without knowing what it would become. It was the right question. It was the question I had been sitting with for 3 weeks. I told him the truth. I needed the table, I said. I needed everyone seated in the room he had built with his own hands, in the family he had always believed in, under the light he had chosen and beside the flowers he had placed there himself. I needed the particular weight of an occasion created by someone who meant it completely, because what I had to say required a container strong enough to hold it, and Elliot, without knowing it, had built exactly that. His love had built the room where the truth could finally be spoken. I could not have done it without him. He looked at the table for a long time after that, at the roses, at the candles burning lower now, the wax pulling softly at their bases, at the china that had been my grandmother's, still set, still waiting. Then he reached over and covered my hand with his. He did not say he forgave me. He did not say he understood everything. There was too much to understand in a single evening, and we both knew it. He said he was here. He said it simply, without performance, in the voice he used for the things that mattered most to him. Just, I'm here. It was enough. It was, in every sense that counted, everything. We sat together in the candlelight long after the caterers had gone, in the room that had held so much that evening. As the candles burned lower and the roses stayed white, and the night outside the windows went perfectly, completely still, neither of us spoke about what would come next. There would be time for that. There is always time after the truth has been told, for the slow and patient work of deciding what to build from what remains. That night there was only the table, and the candles, and the man beside me who had loved me imperfectly and completely for 23 years, and the particular silence of a house that has finally told the truth. In the weeks that followed, The family did what families do when the architecture of their assumptions collapses. They searched for exits, for narratives, for someone else to blame. Leora called twice. The first call was anger, barely contained beneath a thin layer of wounded dignity, the indignation of a woman who had confused being caught with being wronged. She used words like betrayal and humiliation with the conviction of someone who had genuinely reversed the direction of those words in her own mind. I listened. I did not argue. Arguing would have required me to accept the premise that there was something to argue about, and I had moved past that particular room entirely. The second call came 10 days later and was quieter. She did not apologize. She was not yet capable of that, and I did not require it. She simply asked if we could talk. Really talk, she said. Which is what people say when they mean they would like to begin again, without acknowledging what ended. I told her that talking was always possible, and that I would let her know when I was ready. I have not yet been ready. Perhaps one day I will be. Perhaps not. I have made peace with both possibilities, which is itself a kind of freedom I did not know I was waiting for. Rafe called once, briefly, to say that he and Cressida were separating. He said it with the flat, exhausted tone of a man reporting weather, not asking for comfort, not offering explanation, simply stating a fact that had become inevitable the moment she was seen clearly in that dining room. The distance between them in that hallway as they left had not closed. It had, in the days that followed, become permanent. I told him I was sorry. I meant it, not for Cressida's departure, but for the years he had spent becoming someone who needed her particular variety of management. The Rafe I had raised was capable of more than he had allowed himself to be. Whether that version of him was still recoverable, I did not know. I chose to believe it was. I have always found that hope held without demand costs very little and occasionally produces something remarkable. Talia did not call. She sent a message 3 weeks after the dinner that contained no words at all, only a photograph. It was a picture I had never seen before, taken when she was perhaps 6 years old, sitting at the kitchen table in her old house on Ridgeway Drive, drawing something on a large sheet of paper while I stood at the counter behind her, not posing, not performing, simply present in the ordinary way of mothers on ordinary afternoons. Someone had taken it without either of us knowing. I do not know where she found it or why she sent it at that particular moment. I looked at it for a long time. Then I saved it and I said nothing, and I waited the way I have always waited, with the patience that has been, in the end, my greatest and most quietly devastating gift. Jasper and Elliot have not spoken since the night of the dinner. That grief belongs to Elliot, and I have tried to hold space for it without trying to resolve it for him. Brotherhood is its own particular country, with its own particular losses, and a wife cannot cross that border for her husband no matter how much she loves him. Elliot tends to it the way he tends to most difficult things, slowly, physically, in the garden, in the particular therapy of pulling things up and replanting them, as though the earth can absorb what the mind cannot yet hold. I believe it can. I have always believed that. Vivian sent a card, a physical card, pale blue, handwritten. She wrote that she had thought about what happened every day since that evening, that she recognized, in the clear and unforgiving light of aftermath, what she had spent years doing, the quiet, steady accumulation of words and glances and suggestions that she had told herself was simply honesty, but that had been, in truth, something considerably more deliberate. She said she did not expect forgiveness. She said she hoped I was well. I placed the card in the drawer of my desk and have not thrown it away. That feels like its own kind of answer, though I could not tell you precisely what the question is. My attorney finalized everything in December. The 4 organizations named in my will received their documentation and their first distributions. The Women's Financial Independence Foundation invited me to join their advisory board, which I accepted. The scholarship fund issued its first award in the spring, a young woman from Bridgeport, the first in her family to attend college studying accounting, with a particular quiet determination in her face that I recognized immediately and completely. I sat in the back row at the ceremony and did not introduce myself. I did not need to. I bought a smaller house, a place on a hill in Litchfield, with wide windows and a neglected garden that needed attention and a kitchen that faced east, so that the morning light came in long and unhurried in gold. Elliot helped me choose it. He stood in the empty kitchen on a cold January afternoon, with the light coming through the east windows, and said that the bones were good. I told him I knew. He smiled, the smile he uses when he thinks he already knew something I am only now saying out loud. We moved in on the 1st of March. I am writing this from that kitchen. The garden outside is still finding itself. It is early yet, too early for most things, but the forsythia along the back fence has begun to open, yellow and unhurried and completely unbothered by the fact that the cold has not officially ended. I have always loved Forsythia for exactly that quality. It does not wait for permission to become what it already is. I think about that dinner often. Not with anger. The anger was useful for its season, and I released it cleanly when the season passed. Not with grief, exactly. Though grief has visited and been acknowledged and been shown the door with the same quiet firmness I have applied to most things that have overstayed their welcome in my life. I think about it the way you think about a moment that clarified something essential. A night when the life you had been quietly building finally became visible. Not just to the people who had underestimated it, but to yourself. I had known what I had built, but there is a difference between knowing what you have built and standing fully inside it, without apology, in a room full of people who expected you to disappear. That night I did not disappear. That night I arrived. If you are a woman who has been mistaken for less than you are, and I believe that many of you watching this have been, in ways large and small and sometimes devastating, I want you to hear this clearly. The years you spent being underestimated were not wasted. They were the building. Every quiet morning, every decision made without applause, every strength overlooked, and every capability dismissed, none of it was lost. It was accumulating. It was always accumulating. You do not need anyone's permission to be exactly what you already are. The table is still yours to set, and the truth, when you are finally ready to serve it, is best delivered cold. If this story moves something in you today, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want to stay in this world a little longer, the next story is already waiting for you. Click right there. I'll see you in the next one.